trophy wife. That's all she is." My husband Andrew laughed, raising his glass of aged bourbon at the company holiday party. The perfect accessory for a finance director. 6 months later, he was stunned silent when the CEO announced my name as the new director of financial strategy, his department. Now Andrew reports directly to me at the same firm where he once paraded me around like an expensive handbag. The look on his face during that first team meeting was worth every degree I earned in secret. I maintained my practiced smile, the one I'd perfected through 7 years of marriage, and smoothed down my designer dress as if it were suddenly the most important task in the world. Around us, executives from Pinnacle Investments shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, crystal champagne flutes pausing midway to lips, uncertain how to respond to Andrew's casual dismissal of his own wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To the women who make it possible for men like us to focus on what matters, Andrew continued, his voice resonating through the elegantly decorated ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel where Pinnacle held its annual holiday gala. The wives who handle the social calendars and look beautiful at our side. I caught Victoria Reynolds' eye across the room. As Chief Investment Officer, she'd been instrumental in restructuring Pinnacle's international portfolio. Her slight grimace was nearly imperceptible, but I recognized it immediately. The same expression I'd seen yesterday when we'd finalized my employment contract in her private office. "Don't you agree, Victoria?" Andrew called out, drawing unwanted attention to her. "Olivia here couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet, but she throws one hell of a dinner party." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, but it held an undercurrent of discomfort. I felt Victoria tense beside me, but I placed a subtle hand on her arm. Not yet. The timing had to be perfect. "Actually, Andrew," Victoria interjected smoothly, "I was hoping to hear more about Olivia's perspective on—" "Oh, Victoria," Andrew waved his hand dismissively, the platinum cufflinks I'd given him for our 5th anniversary catching the light. "Olivia's perspective is best saved for choosing wine pairings and planning our social engagements. Right, darling?" His fingers dug into my shoulder with what others might mistake for affection, but I felt the possessive pressure behind it, the subtle warning I'd learned to recognize years ago. 7 years of marriage had taught me to read the signs of his social posturing, the slightly too loud laugh, the third drink arriving before dinner was served, the increasingly grandiose declarations about his financial genius. Around us, the ballroom buzzed with nervous energy. The executive team from Pinnacle surrounded us at the reserved VIP table, the men in nearly identical dark suits, the women in cocktail attire carefully selected to convey both professionalism and elegance. Servers in crisp black uniforms circulated, silently, refilling champagne flutes and offering hors d'oeuvres with practiced precision. The holiday party I'd spent weeks helping coordinate, despite having no official role at the company, was unfolding just as planned, except for my husband's mounting condescension. "Tell them, Olivia," Andrew continued, ice cubes clinking against crystal as he gestured with his 4th bourbon of the evening. "Tell them about that time you tried to understand my market volatility report. Remember that?" He turned to James Chen, Pinnacle's chief operations officer, who I'd had coffee with just yesterday morning. "Can you imagine?" I had to explain that some financial concepts are simply beyond a former model's comprehension. Some people are just meant to look pretty at parties. I observed the subtle reactions around the table, mentally cataloging each response, Three executives checking their phones beneath the tablecloth, Victoria's whitening knuckles around her champagne flute, and James's carefully neutral expression that couldn't quite hide his discomfort. My phone vibrated silently in the hidden pocket of my dress. Another update about tomorrow morning's announcement, no doubt. I watched Victoria check her own phone, her expression carefully neutral. We'd spent months planning this, and Andrew's behavior tonight was making it almost too easy. "You know what makes a successful man." Andrew's voice grew louder, words slightly slurred as he addressed the increasingly uncomfortable table. "Having a wife who knows her role. Olivia here has perfected it. No ambitions beyond our home, no silly career dreams competing with mine. Just a beautiful trophy wife. And that's exactly what I need." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. I could feel every gaze in the room, some pitying, others knowing. With deliberate precision, I lifted my water glass, took a careful sip, and placed it back on the table, each movement measured and controlled, just like my response to his latest display of condescension. "Actually, Andrew," I began, using the same quiet authority that I'd utilized in my own interviews with Pinnacle's board just last week. "I'd love to hear more about Victoria's international restructuring strategy." His laugh cut through the air like a knife. "See what I mean? Adorable, isn't she, trying to participate in business talk? Next thing you know, she'll be asking about derivative trading and hedge fund management." My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another update about tomorrow's announcement, no doubt. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. As Andrew continued his monologue about knowing one's place, I glanced at Victoria, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. In less than 14 hours, everything would change. But for now, I was content to play my part as the trophy wife, one last evening. "One last toast," Andrew suddenly declared, raising his glass unsteadily. "To the perfect wife. One who knows her place and keeps to it." He turned to me with what he probably thought was an indulgent smile. "No offense, darling, but some of us are just meant for bigger things. The financial world requires a certain instinct that you can't learn from planning dinner parties and charity events." I raised my glass along with the others, my smile never wavering. If Andrew had been more observant, he might have noticed it didn't reach my eyes. If he'd been less focused on himself, he might have caught the knowing looks exchanged between me and several Pinnacle executives. If he'd been sober enough, he might have realized that his colleagues were paying more attention to his wife's reactions than his words. In 14 hours, everything would change. But for now, I was content to play my part, to be the trophy wife for one last evening. After all, I hadn't spent years earning my MBA and CFA certification in secret by being impatient. Sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones you have to wait for. As I excused myself from the table, Andrew's voice followed me across the ballroom, still regaling his audience with stories of his financial prowess. "My wife wouldn't understand the complexities of what we do," he boasted. "She's better suited for planning our next dinner party than discussing market strategies." In the elegant solitude of the ladies' room, I checked my phone again. 3 urgent messages from Victoria and a brief text from James. Everything is in place for tomorrow. Board approval confirmed. HR documentation finalized. I studied my reflection in the ornate mirror, remembering the exact moment 7 years ago when I decided to keep my professional identity separate from my marriage. Andrew had seemed different then, ambitious but respectful, confident but kind. The change had been gradual, each promotion hardening him, each bonus making him more dismissive of what he called my decorative talents. But tonight was different. Tonight, the carefully constructed wall between Olivia Parker, devoted wife, and Olivia Reeves, MBA and CFA with specialization in financial restructuring, was about to crumble. As I reapplied my lipstick, my hand steady despite the anger simmering beneath my composed exterior, I could still hear Andrew's words echoing in my head. Trophy wife. If only he knew that the trophy wife had been headhunted by Pinnacle's board 3 months ago. If only he realized that his decorative wife had graduated top of her class from Wharton while maintaining her modeling career to pay for tuition. If only he understood that his increasingly poor management and ethical corner-cutting had finally exhausted the patience of Pinnacle's executive team. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tomorrow, Andrew would learn exactly what a trophy wife was capable of. But tonight, I would endure one last dinner as the smiling, nodding wife he thought he had married. I returned to the ballroom to find Andrew in rare form, the bourbon having loosened his tongue further. He was now fully committed to his impromptu lecture on gender roles in finance. You see, gentlemen and ladies, he gestured broadly with his glass, nearly spilling its contents. Women like my Olivia here don't have the killer instinct needed for high-stakes financial strategy. Right, darling? He winked at me as I took my seat. Tell them about that time you tried to understand our quarterly earnings report. I felt Victoria tense beside me, but I placed a subtle hand on her arm. Not yet. The timing had to be perfect. Oh, Andrew, I smiled, playing my part. One last time. You know those numbers just confuse me. Exactly, Andrew practically shouted, pointing at me with his glass. Leave the financial strategy to those who understand it. My wife here is happiest planning galas and charity events. Isn't that right, sweetheart? Little did he know that those events had raised the capital for my first independent investment portfolio, or that the galas were carefully orchestrated networking opportunities where I connected with the industry leaders who now sat on Pinnacle's board. Andrew had never once attended what he called my little parties, never once asked what I actually did during the long hours when he was at the office. His assumption that I spent my days shopping on Fifth Avenue and getting manicures had suited me perfectly, until now. As dessert arrived, I watched Andrew holding court, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around him. In less than 14 hours, he would discover that his department's poor performance had finally caught up with him, that his position as finance director was being restructured, and that the trophy wife he'd been mocking for years was actually Olivia Reeves, the financial restructuring specialist whose credentials had impressed Pinnacle's board enough to hire her above a dozen internal candidates. The midnight sky stretched above us as Andrew and I left the Grand Metropolitan. He was still riding high on what he considered a successful holiday party, completely oblivious to the discomfort he'd caused or the storm brewing on the horizon. The valet brought around our Tesla, a gift Andrew had given himself last year, for closing the Henderson account, and handed me the keys without asking, a tacit acknowledgement of my husband's inebriated state. That went perfectly, Andrew slurred, sliding into the passenger seat with a self-satisfied smile. Reynolds is practically eating out of my hand now. Did you see how impressed everyone was with my portfolio strategy? I nodded non-committally. As I navigated through Manhattan's grid of streets, the city lights reflecting off freshly fallen snow. The city had been my home for nearly 10 years, Ever since I arrived as a wide-eyed modeling hopeful with nothing but ambition and a secret passion for economics, my mind drifted back to my early days building my financial expertise. During day shoots, I'd model designer clothing. During nights, I'd study financial markets and investment strategies. By the time I met Andrew at a charity gala 7 years ago, I had already secured my MBA and was working on my CFA certification, though I was hardly the powerhouse I would become. Chen seemed impressed too, Andrew continued, oblivious to my silence. Smart move bringing him that bourbon from Japan. Nothing says we're solid like knowing what the boss drinks. He chuckled, patting my knee condescendingly. Though maybe next time wear the blue dress instead. The red was a bit attention-seeking for a corporate event. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, remembering why I'd made the decision to keep my professional identity separate from my marriage. When we'd first met, Andrew had been charming and ambitious, a rising analyst at Morgan Stanley before moving to Pinnacle Investments. He'd seemed impressed by my intelligence, even as I downplayed my growing financial expertise, introducing myself simply as, "Olivia, I work in the fashion industry." It wasn't meant to become a permanent deception. In those early days, I'd intended to tell him the truth once we grew more serious. But then came the comments, little things at first. His surprise when I offered an insightful opinion about market trends. His patronizing explanations of basic financial concepts I'd mastered years before. His jokes to friends about how I was pretty smart for a model. By the time he proposed 6 months later, I'd made my decision. Olivia Parker would be his wife, while Olivia Reeves would continue building her financial expertise separately. It seemed simpler that way, cleaner. Andrew got the supportive, beautiful wife he wanted, and I maintained my independence without having to navigate his fragile ego. "Should we stop by your office?" I asked quietly as we approached Midtown. "You mentioned some reports you needed to review before tomorrow." It was a calculated question. I knew exactly what waited at Pinnacle's offices, the beginning of the end. "Nah," Andrew waved dismissively. "Nothing that can't wait until morning. The Henderson portfolio is locked in. Next quarter's going to be our biggest yet." He yawned widely. "Besides, who works after a holiday party?" The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been working on this particular holiday party for weeks, orchestrating not just tonight's event, but tomorrow's restructuring of my husband's department. When I'd been approached by Pinnacle's board 3 months ago, I hadn't planned to use my position to influence Andrew's career. My goal had been purely professional. Pinnacle needed someone to overhaul their struggling financial strategy department, and my track record spoke for itself. The fact that the department was currently led by my husband had been an uncomfortable coincidence, one I'd managed carefully by being transparent with Victoria and the board about my relationship. But over the past year, Andrew's leadership had become increasingly problematic. Reports detailed ethical corners being cut, clients being pushed toward unnecessarily risky investments, and a toxic workplace culture that threatened Pinnacle's reputation and bottom line. I had given him chances to correct course, subtle suggestions over dinner, articles stumbled upon, and shared casually, even anonymous feedback through Pinnacle's communication channels. Nothing had changed. The final straw had come 2 months ago when Andrew's team had implemented changes to client portfolios without proper risk assessments, potentially exposing their investments to significant losses. The vulnerability had been caught and fixed before any serious damage occurred, but Andrew had covered it up rather than addressing the root causes. That night, as I listened to him boast about smoothing things over without anyone knowing, I'd made my decision. This wasn't just about an arrogant husband anymore. It was about protecting clients' financial futures and Pinnacle's integrity. We pulled into the circular driveway of our Upper East Side brownstone, the historic facade illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting I'd installed last spring. Unlike our home's classic exterior, the inside was thoroughly modern. Open concept spaces, smart home technology throughout, and my hidden office behind the library's sliding bookcase, straight out of a spy film. Andrew had laughed when I'd had it installed, calling it my little secret clubhouse where I could play with my charity spreadsheets. If only he knew that behind that hidden door, I'd analyzed market trends, managed my growing personal portfolio, and most recently, prepared the complete restructuring plan for Pinnacle's financial strategy department. "Home sweet home," Andrew mumbled as I helped him from the car. He leaned heavily on me as we walked up the front steps, the scent of expensive cologne and bourbon surrounding us. "You know, Olivia, I'm really proud of you," he said, surprising me with his sudden shift in tone. "The party was perfect," he continued. "Everyone could see what a wonderful wife I have. So supportive, so uncomplicated." And there it was again, the backhanded compliment that reduced me to an accessory in his life. Uncomplicated, simple, just a trophy wife. Inside, I guided him up the stairs to our bedroom, helping him remove his suit and loosen his tie as he continued mumbling about the successful evening. "A perfect end to a perfect night," he said, falling back onto the king-sized bed. "And tomorrow's going to be even better. The Henderson account is going to push my numbers through the roof. I can feel it." I watched as he drifted off to sleep, oblivious to the fact that in less than 8 hours, Victoria Reynolds would be delivering a very different message to Pinnacle's financial strategy department. By this time tomorrow, the department Andrew had led would be in the middle of a complete restructuring, and the wife he'd dismissed as a trophy would be revealed as the financial powerhouse she'd always been. As Andrew began to snore softly, I slipped back downstairs and pressed my palm against the hidden scanner beside the library bookshelf. With a soft hydraulic hiss, the shelf slid aside, revealing my real world, a state-of-the-art office with multiple screens displaying real-time data from markets across the globe. Victoria was waiting on the secure video link, her expression a mixture of anticipation and concern. "Everything set for tomorrow?" I asked, settling into my ergonomic chair. "All systems go," she confirmed. "The announcement is prepared. HR has your employment contract finalized. The department meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. "And the reveal?" I asked, my finger tracing the edge of the desk. Victoria hesitated. "Are you sure about this, Olivia? We could keep your marriage to Andrew private through the transition. No one needs to know that Olivia Reeves, our new Director of Financial Strategy, is Andrew Parker's wife." I considered this for a moment. The private part of me was tempted by this option, to simply be the anonymous force that restructured Andrew's department, to never have to see the recognition dawn in his eyes. But the part of me that had sat through countless dinners being dismissed as just a trophy wife demanded closure. "No," I said finally. "It's time for transparency. 7 years is long enough." Victoria nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd been with me since the beginning, one of the few people who knew both sides of my life. "For what it's worth," she said, "he's a fool who never deserved you." I smiled faintly. Perhaps, but I made my choices too. I straightened in my chair, shifting back into professional mode. Send me the final restructuring paperwork. I'll review it before morning. As the video link ended, I turned to the wall of windows overlooking Manhattan's twinkling skyline. The city that had watched me transform from a struggling model to a financial strategist would now witness the final merging of my divided lives. By this time tomorrow, everyone, including my husband, would know that the trophy wife had earned her place at the table while he wasn't looking. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Let Andrew enjoy his last few hours of blissful ignorance. The morning would bring a reckoning 7 years in the making. If you've made it this far into my story, I know something inside you has been stirred. Perhaps you've experienced the sting of being underestimated, or you've watched someone dismiss a person you care about based on appearances alone. Maybe you're currently hiding your own light because someone in your life can't handle your brilliance. Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful we've connected through this experience. The journey I'm sharing isn't just about comeuppance or revenge. It's about the courage it takes to finally step into your power after years of dimming your light for someone else's comfort. We live in a world that's quick to place people in boxes, especially women. Trophy wife, just a mom, office assistant, just a pretty face. These labels are designed to keep us small, to define us by a single dimension of our complex, capable selves. What I'm about to share in the next part of this story isn't just about a dramatic reversal of fortune. It's about the price we pay when we allow others to define us, the strength it takes to maintain our sense of self in the face of constant diminishment, and ultimately, the liberation that comes from refusing to be anything less than who we truly are. If my journey resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing but means everything to this channel. Your support helps me bring these powerful stories to more people who need to hear them. Plus, when you subscribe, you'll never miss another video where we explore these complex human experiences together. I promise you, what's coming next will be worth every minute. We're about to witness not just the fall of an arrogant man, but the emergence of a woman who refused to be limited by someone else's perception of her. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and join me as we continue this exploration of power, perception, and the quiet strength it takes to play the long game when everyone underestimates you. Because trust me, the moment when Andrew realizes who his trophy wife really is, it's absolutely priceless. The thing about maintaining a double life is that you become a master of compartmentalization. As I lay in bed that night listening to Andrew's bourbon-induced snores, I mentally organized the coming day into distinct chapters: the revelation, the transition, and the aftermath. Each required different skills. Some I'd developed during my modeling career, others during my financial education, and a few I'd honed during 7 years of playing the perfect trophy wife. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:37 a.m., but sleep remained elusive. In less than 7 hours, Andrew would walk into what he thought would be a routine department meeting, only to discover that his professional life was about to undergo a seismic shift. And I would be the epicenter. I slipped quietly from our bed, padding down the hallway to my hidden office. As the bookshelf slid open, revealing my sanctuary, I felt the familiar sense of relief that came with dropping the mask. I wore around Andrew. Here, surrounded by financial texts, market analyses, and the degrees I'd earned while he believed I was organizing charity events, I was truly myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Can't sleep either. Final deck approved. James is bringing coffee and donuts for the team. His way of providing comfort food for what's coming. You ready?" I typed back, as ready as someone can be to upend their entire life. "See you at 8. The truth was, I'd been preparing for this moment for nearly a year. It had started with a chance encounter at a financial conference in Chicago. One, Andrew thought I was attending as a passive companion while he networked. While he was working the main ballroom, I had slipped into a panel discussion on restructuring distressed financial departments, where Victoria Reynolds was the keynote speaker. I had expected to sit anonymously in the back, absorbing information, while maintaining my cover. Instead, I found myself challenging the panel's approach to risk assessment during the Q&A. The moderator had looked startled, then intrigued. Victoria had simply smiled and said, "The woman in the back has just identified the critical weakness in our standard model. I'd like to hear more." After the panel, Victoria had approached me directly. "Your analysis was spot on. Where do you work?" I had hesitated, glancing toward the main ballroom where Andrew was undoubtedly holding court. "It's complicated." Her card appeared between her fingers. "I like complicated. Call me when you're ready to be somewhere your talent is valued." That card had burned a hole in my wallet for months before I finally called her. By then, Andrew's department at Pinnacle was showing troubling signs of mismanagement, and Victoria had recently been promoted to Chief Investment Officer. The timing seemed almost fateful. Now, sitting in my hidden office, I reviewed the presentation deck for tomorrow's meeting one last time. The restructuring plan was solid, reducing unnecessary risk, streamlining processes, reallocating resources to underserved sectors. It was a plan designed to strengthen the department, not dismantle it. The only piece that didn't fit was its current director, Andrew. The board had been explicit in their offer. They wanted me to lead the restructuring, but they understood the potential conflict. "We can hire you as a consultant," the chairwoman had suggested. "Keep your connection to Andrew private." But I had made my decision. 7 years of living in the shadows, of having my intelligence dismissed and my capabilities underestimated, it was enough. It was time for integration, not just of Pinnacle's financial strategy department, but of my divided self. I closed my laptop as dawn began to lighten the sky outside my window. In a few hours, the carefully constructed walls between my personal and professional lives would crumble. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the leap would either break you or set you free. "Where are you going so early?" Andrew mumbled as I emerged from the bathroom, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit I'd never worn in his presence. "Foundation meeting," I replied, using my standard explanation for any activity he didn't bother to understand. He squinted at me through sleep-heavy eyes. "You're awfully dressed up for one of your charity things." "The Westfield Foundation has major donors attending," I said smoothly, naming the organization I'd invented years ago to explain my frequent meetings and occasional travel. "First impressions matter." "Well, don't forget we have the Hendersons for dinner tonight. Make sure you pick up that wine Richard likes." I nodded, knowing there would be no dinner with the Hendersons tonight. By evening, our lives would be unrecognizable. Andrew rolled over, already drifting back to sleep. "Don't pledge too much of my money away," he murmured, repeating his standard joke. I thought of my personal investment portfolio, which had outperformed his for 5 consecutive years, and smiled faintly. "I'll be careful," I assured him, the same response I'd given hundreds of times before. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, winter sunlight glinting off fresh snow. My driver, arranged by Victoria to ensure I arrived calm and collected, waited at the curb, the car's engine already warming the interior. "Good morning, Ms. Reeves," he said as I slid into the back seat. The use of my professional name centered me, a reminder of the identity I would no longer hide. "Pinnacle Investments," I instructed, though he already knew the destination. The drive through Manhattan's awakening streets gave me time to center myself. I'd spent years compartmentalizing my life. Olivia Parker at home, Olivia Reeves professionally. Today, those compartments would collapse into one another. The question was whether I would emerge whole or fractured from the collision. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Arrived early to prep the conference room. Andrew just pulled into the parking garage, earlier than expected. How do you want to play this?" I had anticipated various scenarios for the reveal, but Andrew's early arrival threw a wrench in our carefully orchestrated plan. The original strategy had been for me to meet with Victoria and the executive team first, then have Andrew brought in after the initial announcement to the department. Sometimes, though, the most powerful moments come from embracing the unexpected. "No change in plans," I texted back. "I'll be there in 10. Keep him occupied, but don't tip our hand." As the car navigated the final blocks to Pinnacle's headquarters, I focused on my breathing, a technique I'd learned during my modeling days to project confidence regardless of inner turmoil. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The gleaming glass tower that housed Pinnacle Investments reflected the morning sun as we pulled up to the entrance. I stepped out, nodding my thanks to the driver, and straightened my shoulders before walking through the revolving doors. The security guard at the desk glanced up, recognition flickering across his face. I'd been coming here for weeks, but always through the private entrance, always with Victoria or James as escorts. Today, I approached the main desk directly. "Good morning, Ms. Reeves," he said, checking his list. "They're expecting you in the executive conference room on 42. The elevator ride gave me a final moment of solitude. I watched the numbers climb, 5, 6, 7, each floor bringing me closer to the collision of my two worlds. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake. Would it be simpler to maintain the division, to continue being Olivia Parker at home and Olivia Reeves professionally? But as the elevator passed floor 30, I knew there was no turning back. The compartmentalization that had once felt protective now felt like a prison. I was tired of dimming my light, of pretending to be less than I was to accommodate someone else's ego. The doors opened on floor 42, and Victoria was waiting, her usual composed self despite the tension of the moment. "Change of plans," she said without preamble. "Andrew's called an impromptu team meeting in the main conference room. Apparently, he wants to unveil his new strategy for the Henderson account before the executive announcement." I felt a flicker of irritation at Andrew's presumption, followed by a surge of something like anticipation. "So he's gathered the entire department?" Victoria nodded. "Everyone's there. The executive team is waiting in the side room, but—" "This is perfect," I interrupted, a plan forming instantly. "Let's join his meeting." Her eyebrows rose. "You want to walk in while he's mid-presentation?" "Exactly." A small, vindictive part of me that I usually kept carefully contained rose to the surface. He spent years interrupting me, dismissing my ideas, talking over me. It seems fitting. Victoria studied me for a moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. "I always knew I liked you, Olivia Reeves." She gestured toward the conference room. "Shall we?" Through the glass walls, I could see Andrew standing, at the head of the table, gesturing animatedly as he addressed his team. Around 20 people sat watching him, some taking notes, others showing varying degrees of attention. None of them had noticed us yet. I took a deep breath, centering myself. 7 years of playing small, of nodding and smiling while my intelligence was dismissed, had led to this moment. I thought of all the times Andrew had interrupted me at dinner parties, explained basic concepts I'd mastered years ago, patted my head like I was a child playing at understanding adult matters. "Let's go," I said, pushing open the door. Sound must have been noticeable, because Andrew paused mid-sentence, turning toward the interruption with an annoyed expression that froze when he saw Victoria entering. His annoyance shifted to something like smug satisfaction. The chief investment officer attending his strategy presentation was clearly a coup in his mind. Then I stepped into view behind her, and his expression transformed again. Confusion, followed by deeper confusion as he processed my attire, so different from what he was accustomed to seeing me wear. Olivia? He stumbled over his words. "What are you doing here?" The room had gone completely silent. 20 pairs of eyes darting between Andrew, Victoria, and me, sensing the sudden tension. Victoria spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting, but we need to move up this morning's executive announcement." Andrew's confusion deepened. "What executive announcement?" "The restructuring of the financial strategy department," Victoria replied calmly, moving to stand beside him at the head of the table. I remained by the door, watching the scene unfold. Andrew's shoulders tensed. "What restructuring? This is the first I'm hearing of this." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "That's why we're making the announcement now. The board has approved a complete overhaul of the department's approach, particularly regarding risk assessment and client portfolio management." I could see Andrew processing this information, his mind likely racing to understand how such a significant decision had been made without his knowledge. His gaze darted around the room, taking in his team's reactions, before settling back on Victoria. "I'm the director of this department," he said, a note of defensive anger entering his voice. "Any restructuring would have gone through me first." "Under normal circumstances, yes," Victoria agreed. "But given the nature of the changes and the concerns about current leadership, the board decided to approach this differently." The implication hung in the air. Around the table, Andrew's team shifted uncomfortably. Some looked confused, others, those who had likely been aware of the department's problems, appeared unsurprised. Andrew's face had flushed red. "Concerns about leadership? My department has consistently met its targets. The Henderson account alone will—" "The Henderson account is precisely one of our concerns," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "The risk assessment was incomplete, Andrew. If implemented as planned, it could have exposed both the client and Pinnacle to significant liability." I watched as Andrew's professional facade began to crack. This was the side of him I saw at home when things didn't go his way. The tightening jaw, the slightly flared nostrils, the narrowing eyes. "That's absurd," he snapped. "My analysis was thorough. Who's making these claims? I want to speak to them directly." Victoria glanced toward me, a subtle signal. It was time. I stepped forward, moving to stand at the opposite end of the conference table from Andrew. All eyes in the room turned to me. "I am," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. Andrew stared at me, incomprehension written across his features. "Olivia? What are you talking about? Why are you even here? Victoria interjected smoothly. Allow me to introduce Olivia Reeves, who the board has appointed as the new Director of Financial Strategy, effective immediately. The room erupted in whispers. Andrew's face went from red to white in an instant. This is a joke, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes darted between Victoria and me, searching for the punchline that wasn't coming. It's not a joke, Andrew, I said, maintaining eye contact. I've been brought in to restructure this department following concerns about risk management practices and client portfolio strategies. Andrew's confusion was rapidly giving way to anger. This makes no sense. You're my wife. You're a former model. You run a foundation. You don't know anything about financial strategy. Several people around the table looked startled at this revelation. Victoria remained impassive. Actually, I said, I hold an MBA from Wharton and a CFA certification. I specialized in financial restructuring and risk assessment. My modeling career was how I paid for my education. Andrew's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish out of water. I continued, addressing the room at large now rather than just him. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Olivia Reeves. Some of you may also know me as Olivia Parker. I paused, letting the connection sink in. Yes, I am married to Andrew Parker. For professional reasons, I've maintained separate identities, which is why this may come as a surprise. The expressions around the table ranged from shock to confusion to, from a few of the women, something that looked like admiration. This is insane, Andrew finally managed. You can't be serious. Victoria, the board can't possibly expect me to work under my own wife. Victoria's expression remained professionally neutral. The board has made its decision based on Ms. Reeves's qualifications and the needs of the department. Your personal relationship was disclosed and discussed extensively. The board determined that the benefits of her leadership outweighed any potential complications. Andrew turned to me, his voice lowered but intense. This is how you repay everything I've done for you? By humiliating me professionally? I met his gaze steadily. This isn't about you, Andrew. It's about what's best for Pinnacle and its clients. The department needs restructuring, and I'm qualified to lead that process. Qualified? He scoffed. You've been playing house for 7 years. What could you possibly know about running a financial strategy department? I maintained my composure, aware of the many eyes watching this exchange. I've been consulting with major firms on restructuring for the past 5 years. My approaches have been implemented at 3 of the top 10 financial institutions in the country. While you thought I was planning dinner parties, I was building a reputation as one of the leading experts in financial risk assessment. Andrew's face contorted with disbelief and betrayal. All this time, you've been, what? Living a double life? Lying to me about who you are? The irony of his accusation wasn't lost on me. I never lied about who I am, Andrew. I simply allowed you to see what you wanted to see. You decided on our 3rd date that I couldn't possibly understand finance at your level. You created the narrative of the decorative wife, and I chose not to correct you. Andrew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is a setup, a conspiracy to push me out. Victoria stepped in, her tone firm but not unkind. This isn't a termination, Andrew. You're being reassigned to lead the personal investment division, where your client relationship skills will be valuable. It comes with the same compensation package, though you'll be reporting to the new departmental structure. She paused, which means reporting to Olivia. The realization visibly struck him like a physical blow. His gaze darted around the room, taking in the witnesses to his humiliation, before settling back on me with a cold fury I recognized from our worst. Arguments at home? I won't do it, he said flatly. I won't work under her. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. That's your choice, of course. But I should be clear. This isn't a negotiation. The restructuring is happening with or without you. If you choose to leave Pinnacle rather than accept the reassignment, we'll respect that decision, but there won't be an alternative position available. Andrew stood frozen, trapped between his pride and his career ambitions. I knew him well enough to recognize the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing the professional suicide of walking out against the daily humiliation of reporting. To the wife he'd dismissed as nothing more than a pretty ornament. The silence stretched uncomfortably until I decided to break it. We should continue this discussion privately, I said, addressing both Andrew and Victoria. The team needs time to process this change. I turned to the gathered employees. I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the next few days to discuss your roles in the restructured department. For now, please return to your regular tasks. James will distribute the transition briefing documents. My natural authority seemed to surprise everyone, Andrew most of all. The team began gathering their materials, the room filling with the murmur of stunned conversations and shuffling papers. Andrew remained rooted in place, staring at me as if seeing a stranger. As the room emptied, leaving just Andrew, Victoria, and me, I felt a strange sense of calm descend. The moment I had both dreaded and anticipated for months had arrived, and somehow I felt more myself than I had in years. I'll give you two a moment, Victoria said tactfully, moving toward the door. Andrew, once you've had time to consider the reassignment offer, HR has the paperwork ready. She gave me a supportive nod before leaving, closing the door behind her. And then we were alone, husband and wife, facing each other across a corporate conference table, the ruins of our carefully separated lives scattered between us. Why? Andrew asked, his voice hoarse. Why go to these lengths to humiliate me? I studied him, this man I had married, this man who had never truly seen me. This isn't about humiliating you, Andrew. It's about finally stepping into my full self after years of playing small to protect your ego. Protect my... He broke off, laughing bitterly. You've been lying to me for our entire marriage, and you want to frame it as some kind of self-sacrifice? You manipulated me. Did I? I asked quietly. Or did you simply see what you wanted to see? A beautiful woman who would stand in your shadow, who would never challenge your sense of superiority. You created that narrative from our earliest dates. All I did was not correct you. Andrew paced the length of the conference room, running, his hands through his perfectly styled hair. You could have told me any time. You chose not to. You chose to build a secret life behind my back. You're right, I acknowledged. I made that choice. And for a long time, it seemed easier than constantly fighting your preconceptions. But the division became toxic, for me, for us, and ultimately for your professional judgment. He stopped, pacing, turning to face me with narrowed eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Your leadership has been compromised by the same attitude you bring home, Andrew. You dismiss input from women on your team. You overrule concerns raised by analysts who don't fit your ideal image. The Henderson portfolio strategy has 3 critical flaws that were identified by your team and ignored because you couldn't accept being wrong. His jaw tightened. That's not... It is, I interrupted firmly. And it's exactly why this department needs restructuring. Your personal blind spots have become professional vulnerabilities. Andrew stared at me, a mixture of anger and dawning, comprehension crossing his face. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he was truly seeing me. Not as the trophy wife he had invented, but as the competent, ambitious woman I had always been. "So what now?" he asked finally. "You expect me to work under my own wife? To come home every night to my boss? It's humiliating." I considered his question seriously. "I expect you to make a professional decision about your career. If you choose to stay at Pinnacle, then yes, you would report through the new departmental structure. If that's untenable for you, no one would fault you for exploring opportunities elsewhere." "And personally?" he pressed. "What happens to our marriage?" It was the question I had been asking myself for months, through every stage of planning, for this moment. The answer had only become clear in the past few days. "I think we both know that our marriage has been built on a foundation of misunderstanding and misrepresentation," I said gently. "You wanted a trophy wife. I wanted to be valued for my mind. Neither of us got what we truly needed." Andrew's anger seemed to deflate, leaving something that looked almost like grief in its place. "So that's it? 7 years just over?" "I think they've been over for a long time," I replied. "We've just been going through the motions, playing roles that neither of us truly fit." He sank into one of the conference room chairs, suddenly looking smaller than I had ever seen. "I don't even know who you are," he said quietly. "That's part of the problem," I acknowledged. "But it's also an opportunity. Maybe it's time we both discovered who we really are, separately." Andrew nodded slowly, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "I need time to think," he said finally, "about the job, about everything." "Take the time you need," I said, gathering my notes. "I'll be staying at the Peninsula until we figure out next steps." I moved toward the door, pausing with my hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Andrew, I did love you. Just not the version of me you wanted me to be." As I stepped out of the conference room, leaving my shaken husband behind, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: regret for the pain I had caused, relief at finally being free of pretense, and a surging sense of possibility about the future. Victoria was waiting in the hallway, her expression questioning. "I think he'll take the reassignment," I said. "At least temporarily. His pride won't let him walk away entirely." She nodded. "And personally?" "That chapter is ending," I said simply. "It's time for both of us to stop playing roles that don't fit." As we walked toward my new office, the same one that had been Andrew's until this morning, I felt the weight of 7 years of division beginning to lift. Tomorrow would bring challenges: a department to restructure, a marriage to unwind, a new life to build. But for the first time in years, I would face those challenges as my complete self, not as Andrew Parker's trophy wife, not as the secret, financial expert Olivia Reeves, but as the whole, integrated person I was always meant to be. Sometimes the most courageous act isn't standing up to others, but standing up for yourself, claiming the space to be fully, unapologetically who you are, even when that disrupts the comfortable patterns others have built around you. In breaking free from the trophy case Andrew had placed me in, I wasn't just changing my circumstances. I was reclaiming my right to define myself. The 3 weeks following what quickly became known around Pinnacle as the Revelation were a masterclass in professional transformation. I moved from the Upper East Side brownstone into a sleek downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural light. No hidden rooms, no secret compartments, nothing concealed. For the first time in 7 years, I lived in a space that reflected me wholly, not just the carefully curated version I showed to Andrew. Each morning, I arrived at Pinnacle as Olivia Reeves Parker, the hyphenated compromise I'd suggested during our still ongoing divorce negotiations, stepped into the office that had once been Andrew's and led the restructuring of a department that had been drifting dangerously off course under his leadership. Andrew, to his credit and to my surprise, had accepted the reassignment. Pride had warred visibly with practicality on his face during our confrontation in the conference room, but ultimately, self-preservation won. He moved to the personal investment division, where his client relationship skills could shine without the burden of strategic oversight that had been his downfall. We maintained a careful professional distance at work, nodding politely when passing in hallways, exchanging necessary emails with formal courtesy. To the casual observer, we might have been any two executives navigating office politics. Only the occasional lingering glance from him, a mixture of resentment and bewilderment, betrayed our more complicated history. The Henderson portfolio review is complete, Victoria announced, stepping into my office and closing the door behind her. You were right about the risk exposure. It was even worse than we initially assessed. Your restructuring plan saved us from a potential disaster. I nodded, accepting the thick report she placed on my desk. How's the team adapting to the new protocols? Better than expected. Especially the junior analysts. Turns out several of them had raised concerns about the original strategy, but were shut down. Victoria settled into the chair across from me, her expression shifting from professional to personal. And how are you holding up? 3 weeks of being fully Olivia must be an adjustment. I considered her question carefully. The transition had been seismic in many ways, professionally exhilarating, but personally draining. The divorce proceedings were amicable on paper, but emotionally raw in reality. Andrew alternated between cold fury and wounded confusion in our private discussions, still struggling to reconcile the woman he'd married with the executive who now occupied his former position. It's like learning to breathe again after years of shallow inhalations, I finally replied. Exhausting but necessary. Victoria nodded, understanding in her eyes. And Andrew? How's he handling the new dynamic? As well as can be expected, for someone whose entire worldview has been upended. He's doing good work in personal investments, though. James says he's been surprisingly effective with the high-net-worth clients. That doesn't surprise me, Victoria said. Andrew's always been skilled at making people feel important. It was managing the behind-the-scenes complexity where he struggled. A knock at my door interrupted our conversation. My assistant Rebecca poked her head in. Excuse me, Ms. Reeves Parker. The quarterly review meeting is starting in 5 minutes in the main conference room. Thank you, Rebecca. We'll head over shortly. As Rebecca closed the door, Victoria raised an eyebrow. Ready to face him in the executive meeting? This will be your first time presenting to the full leadership team with Andrew present. I gathered my presentation materials, a flicker of nervousness dancing through my stomach despite my preparation. Ready or not, it's happening. The department's performance speaks for itself. The numbers don't lie. Besides, Victoria added with a small smile as we walked toward the conference room, it might be good for Andrew to see what you've accomplished. With his mess. The executive conference room was already nearly full when we arrived. 12 department heads sat around the polished mahogany table, with the CEO Richard Blackwell at its head. Andrew sat midway down the right side, studying, his tablet with careful concentration, pointedly not looking up as I entered. Olivia," Richard called, his voice carrying across the room. "We're eager to hear about the restructuring progress. I understand you've already implemented significant changes." All eyes turned to me as I took my place at the table, directly across from where Andrew sat. I could feel the weight of their collective curiosity, not just about the department's performance, but about the personal drama that had captivated office gossip for weeks. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, my voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. "I've prepared a comprehensive overview of the Financial Strategy Department's transformation over the past 3 weeks. The results, I believe, speak for themselves." I launched into my presentation, walking the executive team through the restructuring process, the identification of critical vulnerabilities, the implementation of new risk assessment protocols, the reallocation of resources to strengthen underserved areas. With each slide, each data point, I could see the executive's expressions shifting from skeptical curiosity to genuine interest to impressed approval. Andrew remained stone-faced throughout, his eyes fixed on his tablet, occasionally making notes, but never looking directly at me. Only the tightening of his jaw at particularly impressive metrics betrayed any reaction at all. "Most significantly," I continued, advancing to the final slide, "we've reduced portfolio risk exposure by 37%, while actually increasing projected returns by 2%. The Henderson account, which was our most concerning case, has been completely restructured with the client's enthusiastic approval." Richard leaned forward, studying the numbers with keen interest. "These results are remarkable, Olivia, especially in such a short time frame. How did you accomplish this when the previous approach had been in place for years?" I felt the weight of Andrew's gaze finally lift to meet mine. This was the moment, the chance to either publicly vindicate myself at his expense or to demonstrate the grace that he had never shown me. "The foundation was already there," I said carefully. "The department has always had talented analysts and strong client relationships. What was missing was a fresh perspective on risk assessment and a more collaborative approach to strategy development. Sometimes it takes an outsider's eye to see what those closest to a situation might miss." It wasn't exactly letting him off the hook, but it wasn't throwing him under the bus either. Around the table, I saw knowing glances exchanged. Everyone understood what I wasn't saying. Andrew's expression remained unreadable, but something in the set of his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up," Richard concluded. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need at Pinnacle. Now, let's move on to operations." As the meeting continued, I felt a strange sense of completion. For years, I had sat silently at corporate events, while Andrew had explained finance to rooms full of people, positioning himself as the expert while dismissing my capabilities. Today, I had finally stepped fully into my expertise, not as Andrew Parker's wife, but as Olivia Reeves, financial strategist. When the meeting concluded, executives filtered out in small groups, several pausing to congratulate me on the department's turnaround. Andrew remained seated, methodically gathering his materials while the room emptied around us. I could have left, should have perhaps, but something kept me in place, waiting. When the last executive departed, leaving just the two of us, Andrew finally spoke. "Impressive presentation," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The Henderson restructuring particularly. That was always a complex account." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by the professional acknowledgement. "Your initial client relationship groundwork made the transition much smoother." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps at my reciprocal professional courtesy, crossed his face before settling back into careful composure. "Our lawyers finalized the asset division this morning," he said, abruptly changing the subject. "They should be sending the documents for your review this afternoon." I nodded. I received a call from mine. Everything seemed straightforward. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and unexpressed emotions. 7 years of marriage dissolving into a clinical division of assets and a professional reassignment. It seemed both sadly inadequate and entirely appropriate. "Why didn't you tell me?" Andrew asked suddenly, the question bursting from him as if he could no longer contain it. "Not about the job. I understand why that had to be handled as it was. But about you, about your education, your expertise. Why maintain the charade for 7 years?" It was the question he had been asking in various forms since the revelation, in angry accusations during our confrontation, in bitter text messages during the first days of separation, in formal queries through our respective attorneys. But this was the first time he had asked it directly, simply, without the armor of rage or legal intermediaries. I considered my answer carefully, knowing it mattered. Not for our future, which was clearly diverging, but for both our abilities to make sense of the past we had shared. "It wasn't a single decision," I said finally. "It was 1,000 tiny choices, each seeming easier than confrontation. By the time I recognized the cage I'd built for myself, the bars felt unbreakable without destroying everything." Andrew nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said, the admission clearly costing him something. "She suggested I might have contributed to the dynamic. That perhaps I needed you to be less so that I could feel like more." The self-awareness was so unexpected, so contrary to the Andrew I had known, that for a moment I could only stare at him. "That's insightful," I managed finally. A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "Apparently being professionally humiliated by your secret genius wife is quite the catalyst for personal growth." Despite everything, I found myself smiling in return. I never meant it as humiliation. "I know that now," he acknowledged, though it took some time and several expensive therapy sessions to get there. Another silence fell between us, but this one felt different, less charged, more contemplative. "I've accepted a position with Meridian Capital," Andrew said finally, "starting next month. I think it's best for both of us if I'm not at Pinnacle anymore." I nodded, a mixture of emotions swirling through me. Relief that the daily awkwardness would end, sadness for what might have been if we had begun our relationship with authenticity, pride that he was making a clean break rather than lingering in resentment. "Meridian is lucky to have you," I said, sincerely. "Your client relationship skills are exceptional." "And my risk assessment skills are not," he finished with unexpected honesty. "A fact I might have recognized sooner if I'd been willing to see you clearly." He stood, gathering his materials. "I wish you every success, Olivia. You've more than earned it." As he walked toward the door, I felt the chapter truly closing. Not just the professional overlap, but the personal entanglement that had defined the past 7 years of my life. "Andrew," I called, stopping him at the threshold. "For what it's worth, I think you'll thrive at Meridian. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need to become who we're meant to be." He nodded once, a final acknowledgement, before disappearing into the hallway. I remained in the conference room for a long moment, processing the exchange. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, nor was it reconciliation. But it was something I hadn't expected. Mutual recognition of the flawed dynamic we had created together, and mutual release from its constraints. My phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. Executive team buzzing about your presentation. Richard wants to discuss expanding your role. Dinner tonight to strategize? I smiled, typing back a quick agreement before gathering my own materials. As I walked back to my office, not Andrew's that I had claimed, I felt lighter, somehow, as if the final weight of my divided life had been lifted. Rebecca met me at the door, schedule in hand. The risk assessment team is waiting for your input on the new protocol documentation. The board needs your quarterly projections by end of day, and Ms. Reynolds confirmed dinner at Lucian's at 7. Thank you, Rebecca, I replied, settling behind my desk. Let's start with the risk assessment team. As the day progressed, I found myself fully immersed in the work. Not as Andrew's wife proving a point, not as the secret expert finally revealed, but simply as Olivia Reeves Parker, doing what I had trained for, what I excelled at, what gave me purpose. By evening, the sky outside my office windows had darkened to indigo, the city lights creating a glittering panorama beyond the glass. I was reviewing the final edits to the board presentation when Victoria appeared in my doorway. Almost ready? She asked. I've booked the private dining room at Lucian's. Richard will be joining us briefly to discuss your expanded role. I glanced at the time, surprised to find it was already 6:45. Just finishing up here. I'll meet you in the lobby in 10 minutes. After Victoria departed, I saved my work and stood, stretching muscles tense from hours of concentration. Moving. To the window, I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, each illuminated building housing countless stories like mine, people struggling to be seen fully, to contribute meaningfully, to reconcile the various facets of themselves into a coherent whole. For 7 years, I had lived divided. Olivia the trophy wife at home, Olivia the financial expert in secret. The compartmentalization had seemed necessary at first, then simply easier than disruption, until finally it became an unbearable constraint on my authentic self. The past 3 weeks of integration, painful and messy as they had been, had brought me more alignment and purpose than all the years of careful separation. There was a powerful lesson there, one worth sharing with others who might be dimming their own light to accommodate the insecurities around them. My phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. Package delivered to your apartment as requested. Signed receipt. I smiled, knowing what the package contained. The framed degrees and certifications that had been hidden in my secret office at the brownstone, now destined for prominent display in my new apartment. No more hiding, no more diminishing, no more playing small. Gathering my coat and bag, I took one final look around the office that had once been Andrew's domain and was now unquestionably mine. On the credenza behind my desk, I had placed a small silver frame containing a quote that had become my mantra during this transition. Your need for acceptance can make you invisible in this world. Risk being seen in all your glory. It was time to be fully visible, not as someone's wife, not as someone's boss, but as the complete, complex, capable woman I had always been. The elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby where Victoria waited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the expanded role Richard wanted to discuss, the finalization of my divorce, the continued integration of my professional and personal identities. But for the first time in years, I would face those challenges as my whole self, no longer fragmented by others' expectations or my own compromises. As the elevator doors opened onto the marble-floored lobby, I stepped forward into the next chapter of my undivided life. "There you are," Victoria called, rising from one of the sleek leather sofas. "Car's waiting. Ready to discuss your future?" I smiled, feeling the confident alignment of my inner and outer selves. "More than ready. Let's go." Outside, Manhattan pulsed with evening energy, taxis weaving through traffic, pedestrians hurrying along illuminated sidewalks, the ceaseless rhythm of a city that never sleeps. As our car pulled away from the curb, I watched Pinnacle's gleaming tower recede in the window, no longer the site of my greatest professional deception, but the stage for my most authentic revelation. Victoria reviewed the evening's agenda as we navigated through midtown traffic, but my mind drifted briefly to Andrew. He would be starting fresh at Meridian next month, rebuilding his professional identity without the shadow of our complicated history. I wished him well in that journey, genuinely. Sometimes relationships aren't meant to last forever, but to teach us essential truths about ourselves. What we need, what we deserve, what we're capable of becoming when we stop contorting ourselves to fit others' expectations. "You're quiet," Victoria observed as we neared the restaurant. "Having second thoughts about the expanded role?" I shook my head, smiling. "Just reflecting on how much can change in 3 weeks when you finally stop hiding who you are. Or in your case, what you know," she added with a knowing smile. "I still wish I could have seen Andrew's face when you walked into that conference room." "It wasn't about humiliating him," I reminded her, and myself. "It was about claiming my rightful place at the table." "And now you've got the head chair," Victoria pointed out as our car pulled up to Lucian's. "With more responsibility coming your way tonight, if I'm reading Richard correctly." The restaurant's maitre d' greeted us by name, escorting us to the private dining room where Richard was already waiting, reviewing documents while nursing a glass of scotch. "Ah, the woman of the hour," he said, rising as we entered. "Olivia, your presentation today was exactly what the board has been waiting to see. The turnaround in financial strategy has exceeded all expectations." "Thank you, Richard," I replied, accepting the seat he offered. "The team deserves much of the credit. They just needed clear direction and proper support." Richard waved away my modesty. "Leadership begins at the top, and you've demonstrated extraordinary leadership under unusually challenging circumstances." He glanced meaningfully at Victoria. "Which is why we'd like to discuss a new opportunity with you." Victoria leaned forward, her expression animated. "Richard and I have been reviewing Pinnacle's overall structure, and we believe there's a critical gap in our executive team, one that your unique skill set would fill perfectly." Richard nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "We'd like to create a new position, Chief Risk and Strategy Officer, overseeing risk management across all divisions. You'd report directly to me, with department heads including your current replacement in financial strategy reporting to you." I opened the folder, scanning the detailed proposal within. The position description was ambitious, a significant expansion of responsibilities, a substantial increase in compensation, and a seat on the executive leadership committee that determined Pinnacle's overall direction. "This is considerable," I said, taking in the scope of the opportunity. "It's commensurate with your abilities," Richard replied. "Abilities that were hidden for too long. I won't pretend I wasn't shocked by the revelation of your identity. We all were. But in retrospect, I'm more shocked that we missed the opportunity to bring your talents to Pinnacle years ago." I wasn't exactly advertising them, I acknowledged with a small smile. No, Richard agreed. And while I won't pry into your personal reasons for that, I will say that Pinnacle benefits enormously from you finally stepping into the spotlight. We don't want to lose that benefit to another firm that might recognize what we now see clearly. The offer was everything I could have hoped for professionally: recognition, challenge, influence, compensation. But it also represented something more profound: the complete integration of my fragmented selves into a cohesive whole, recognized and valued for my complete capabilities. I'd need to review the details, I said, though my mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities. Of course, Richard nodded. Take the weekend. We can discuss your thoughts on Monday. He checked his watch. I should leave you, ladies. To your dinner. Early flight to London tomorrow. He stood, extending his hand. I look forward to your decision, Olivia. I think you'll find the role allows you to fully utilize the talents you've kept hidden for too long. After Richard departed, Victoria signaled the waiter for champagne. This calls for celebration, she declared. From secret financial expert to C-suite in 3 weeks. That has to be some kind of corporate record. I laughed, feeling a lightness that had been absent for years. It's not official yet. It will be, Victoria insisted as champagne was poured. Unless you're crazy enough to turn it down. I lifted my glass, considering the path that had led me here. From the young model studying finance in secret, to the trophy wife concealing her expertise, to the revealed professional now being offered one of the highest positions at Pinnacle. Each step had required choices, compromises, and finally, the courage to be fully seen. To stepping into the spotlight, Victoria toasted. To being seen in all our glory, I countered, clinking my glass against hers. As we enjoyed our meal, I found my thoughts returning to the question Andrew had asked earlier. Why maintain the my charade for 7 years? The answer I'd given him was true, but incomplete. Yes, it had been 1,000 tiny choices, each seeming easier than confrontation. But beneath that was a more uncomfortable truth. A part of me had been afraid. Afraid of rejection if I revealed my full self. Afraid of conflict if I challenged his perception. Afraid of discovering that if I stopped contorting myself to fit his expectations, the relationship might not survive. And so I had made myself smaller, dimmer, less threatening to his ego, convincing myself it was a necessary compromise rather than a slow surrender of my authentic self. You've gone thoughtful again, Victoria observed, breaking into my reverie. I smiled apologetically. Just processing everything that's happened. 3 weeks ago, I was still Andrew's trophy wife. Now I'm being offered a C-suite position and finalizing my divorce papers. Regrets? She asked, studying me carefully. I considered the question seriously. Not about the revelation or the divorce. Those were necessary, overdue even. But I do regret not being braver sooner. Not with Andrew necessarily, but with myself. I spent years convincing myself that compartmentalization was a practical solution rather than a form of self-betrayal. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. The compromises we make to keep peace often create a different kind of war within ourselves. Exactly, I agreed. And the longer we make those compromises, the harder it becomes to find our way back to authenticity. Well, Victoria raised her glass again. Here's to no more compromises, to being unapologetically brilliant, ambitious, and whole. I clinked my glass against hers, feeling the truth of her words resonating through me. to being unapologetically whole. Later that evening, as my driver navigated toward my downtown apartment, I watched the city scroll past my window. Each streetlight, each glittering building, each anonymous pedestrian representing possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine during my years of careful division. The package Rebecca had arranged waited just inside my apartment door, a large flat box from my personal shopper. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay my framed degrees and certifications, cleaned and reframed for prominent display in my new life. I hung them carefully in my home office, stepping back to admire the visual representation of my journey. The Wharton MBA, the CFA certification, the awards and recognitions I'd earned while maintaining my secret professional identity. No more hiding, no more diminishing the evidence of my capabilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrew. Signed the final papers, being sent to your attorney tomorrow, wishing you success in whatever comes next. A simple message, yet markedly different from the angry texts of 3 weeks ago. We had both begun the process of healing, separately as was necessary, but with a growing recognition of the flawed dynamic we had created together. I typed back a brief response. Received my copies as well. Wishing you every success at Meridian. Thank you for your graciousness today. Setting my phone aside, I moved to the wall of windows that had drawn me to this apartment. Below, Manhattan pulsed with evening energy. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were making the same compromises I had made, dimming their light to make others comfortable, hiding their capabilities to maintain peace, fragmenting themselves into acceptable pieces rather than risking the vulnerability of being wholly seen. If my story could inspire even one person to break that pattern sooner than I had, to claim their rightful space without apology, to risk being seen in all their glory, then perhaps the painful lessons of the past 7 years served a greater purpose than merely my own liberation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the careful consideration of Richard's offer, the final legal dissolution of my marriage, the continued integration of my professional and personal identities. But tonight, standing in the glow of city lights, surrounded by the symbols of my achievement, I felt a profound sense of homecoming, not to a physical space but to myself. The division was over, the integration had begun, and the woman who had been forced to choose between being Andrew's trophy wife and Olivia Reeves, financial expert, could finally be her complete, authentic self. Brilliant and beautiful, ambitious and compassionate, strong and vulnerable, wholly unapologetically Olivia. 6 months can transform everything. The Manhattan skyline remained the same, glittering towers reaching toward the clouds, the constant flow of life in the streets below. But my view of it had fundamentally changed. I no longer observed it through the lens of a woman living half a life. Ms. Reeves, your 2 hours appointment is here, my executive assistant announced through the intercom. I smiled at the name, Olivia Reeves, not Parker, not Reeves Parker. After the divorce was finalized, I had reclaimed my professional identity fully, shedding the last vestige of the trophy wife persona. Send them in, I replied, closing the quarterly report I'd been reviewing. The glass door to my office opened, admitting a young woman in her late 20s, dressed in a crisp suit, but wearing an expression of barely contained nervousness. Ms. Reeves, she began, extending her hand. I can't thank you enough for agreeing to meet with me. Your assistant said you only had 15 minutes, so I'll be brief. Melissa, please sit. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. And call me Olivia. She settled into the seat, her portfolio clutched tightly in her lap. I've been following your story since it made the news 6 months ago. What you did, stepping into your power after years of being underestimated, it changed how I think about my own career. I nodded encouragingly, remembering my promise to myself that if my story could inspire even one person to break free from similar constraints, the painful lessons of my marriage would serve a greater purpose. I'm in a situation, Melissa continued, her voice gaining confidence. Not exactly like yours, but similar enough. I've been hiding my finance degree from my current employer because our department head makes it clear he prefers people who stay in their lane. I've been playing small for 3 years, and after reading about you, I decided that needs to end. And how can I help? I asked, already suspecting where this conversation was headed. The truth is, she took a deep breath, I'm interviewing for the senior analyst position in your risk management division. I know I'm qualified, overqualified actually, but I worried my resume doesn't reflect my full capabilities because I've been hiding them for so long. I smiled, remembering how it felt to finally step into the fullness of my expertise after years of deliberate diminishment. Hiding your light doesn't serve anyone in the long run. Not you, not your colleagues, not the organizations that could benefit from your full contribution. Melissa nodded eagerly. That's exactly what I realized after your story broke. But now I'm worried about how to explain the disconnect between what I've been doing and what I'm actually capable of. I leaned forward, my 15-minute mentoring session suddenly feeling far more significant than the executive meeting that would follow it. The past doesn't define your future potential. We're interviewing for what you can do, not what you've been allowed to do until now. Relief washed over her face. Thank you. That means more than you know. Bring your full self to the interview, I advised. No more dimming your light to make others comfortable. The right organization, and this one aims to be that, wants you to shine at full brightness. After Melissa left, I turned back to the windows, reflecting on how my own journey had become something of a catalyst in the financial industry. When the story first broke, finance director's trophy wife, revealed as financial expert, takes his position. It had created a media frenzy. Business publications analyzed the professional angles while gossip columns feasted on the personal drama. But something unexpected had emerged from the sensationalism. Women across the industry began sharing their own stories of diminishment, of hiding their capabilities to accommodate fragile egos, of playing small to keep the peace. What had started as my personal reckoning had sparked a broader conversation about women in finance claiming their rightful place at the table. My phone chimed with a reminder. Executive Committee Meeting, 2:30 p.m., boardroom. I gathered my materials, including the proposal for expanding our risk management approach across all Pinnacle divisions, the culmination of my first 6 months as Chief Risk and Strategy Officer. As I walked through the executive floor toward the boardroom, I passed the portraits of Pinnacle's leadership through the years, a succession of serious-looking men in dark suits, until finally, the newest additions. Victoria Reynolds, Chief Investment Officer, and me, Olivia Reeves, Chief Risk and Strategy Officer. 2 women now shaped Pinnacle's strategic direction alongside the CEO and other executives. There she is, Richard called as I entered the boardroom. The woman who's revolutionizing how we think about risk at Pinnacle. The executive team was already assembled around the polished table, tablets and coffee cups at the ready. In 6 months, I had established myself firmly within this circle, my insights sought after, my recommendations implemented across divisions. Before we begin, Richard continued, I wanted to share some news. The Henderson portfolio, the one Olivia restructured in her first weeks here, has outperformed projections by 12% this quarter. The client is ecstatic. Nods of approval circulated around the table. The Henderson account had become something of a showcase for my approach to balancing risk and return, a case study in how proper risk assessment could actually enhance performance rather than constrain it. Thank you, Richard, I acknowledged. But credit goes to the entire financial strategy team. They embraced the new approach and executed it flawlessly. The meeting proceeded smoothly, each department head reporting on quarterly results, strategic initiatives, and upcoming challenges. When my turn came, I presented the expanded risk management framework, a comprehensive system designed to identify vulnerabilities across divisions while fostering innovation rather than stifling it. What distinguishes this approach, I explained, advancing to a key slide, is that it doesn't treat risk as something merely to be avoided, but as something to be understood and strategically balanced. Our goal isn't to eliminate risk, that's impossible in our industry, but to ensure we're taking the right risks for the right reasons. Questions followed, incisive, challenging, exactly what you'd expect from an executive team tasked with guiding a major financial institution. I answered each one with the confidence that came from years of expertise, no longer filtered through the lens of what someone else might find threatening. I think we have a consensus, Richard concluded after the discussion. Let's implement the framework across all divisions, starting with a pilot in operations next month. Excellent work, Olivia. As the meeting adjourned, Victoria fell into step beside me. Drinks tonight? I think we should celebrate the Henderson results. Serafina. At 7? I nodded, grateful as always for her friendship. Victoria had been my ally from the beginning, recognizing my capabilities when others, most significantly my own husband, had dismissed them. In the month since the revelation, our professional collaboration had deepened into a genuine friendship that extended beyond Pinnacle's walls. Back in my office, I found a package waiting on my desk. A small box elegantly wrapped in silver paper. The card read simply, "A token of appreciation for saving my company from financial ruin. Richard." Inside was a beautiful silver paperweight engraved with a quote. She turned her can'ts into cans and her dreams into plans. I smiled at Richard's thoughtfulness. He had become a genuine advocate for women in leadership, acknowledging that his previous blind spots had cost Pinnacle valuable talent over the years. As afternoon turned to evening, I completed my final tasks for the day before meeting Victoria at Serafina, our favorite wine bar near Bryant Park. She was already seated at our usual corner table, 2 glasses of Cabernet waiting. To the woman who saved the Henderson account and revolutionized Pinnacle's approach to risk, she toasted as I sat down, while looking fabulous doing it, I might add. I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. And to the woman who recognized that potential when I was still hiding in plain sight. Speaking of recognition, Victoria said after we'd ordered, have you seen the Financial Women's Association announcement? You're on the short list for their Impact Award this year. I hadn't seen it, having deliberately avoided financial news sites in recent weeks as I focused on finalizing my expanded risk management framework. That's unexpected. It shouldn't be, Victoria replied firmly. Your story has resonated. With so many women in the industry, you're becoming something of an icon. The idea was still uncomfortable, that my personal journey, born from necessity rather than a desire for attention, had taken on broader significance. I had never sought to be an example or a symbol. I had simply reached the breaking point of my own division, the moment when maintaining the charade became more painful than dismantling it. "I met with a young analyst today," I said, changing the subject slightly. "She's interviewing for a position in risk management." Said my story inspired her to stop hiding her own capabilities. Victoria smiled knowingly. "That's happening more than you realize. HR has noted a significant uptick in female applicants for leadership positions since your promotion hit the news. You've created a gravity shift at Pinnacle and beyond." We spent the evening discussing industry developments, Victoria's new apartment, and my upcoming presentation at the Global Finance Summit, my first major speaking engagement since accepting my new role. Neither of us mentioned Andrew directly, though his absence from both our professional and personal landscapes hung in the air unacknowledged. It was late when I finally returned to my downtown apartment, the lights of the city spread below my windows like a blanket of stars. I kicked off my heels and poured a small glass of bourbon, a taste I'd developed only after my divorce, one of many small ways I was discovering who Olivia Reeves was when not defined by her relationship to Andrew Parker. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the announcement about your speaking engagement at the summit. Congratulations, you've earned it. Andrew." After 6 months of silence following his departure to Meridian Capital, this single text carried the weight of unspoken conversations. Not hostile, not overly familiar. Just a simple acknowledgement from someone who once knew me intimately but never truly saw me. I considered responding but ultimately set the phone aside. Some chapters close cleanly, others linger in the margins. Our story had been told, the ending written in divorce papers and career transitions. Whatever gesture Andrew was making now, closure, reconciliation, simple professional courtesy, belonged to a narrative I had moved beyond. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the draft of my summit presentation, hidden in plain sight, recognizing untapped potential in financial leadership. As I reviewed the slides, I was struck by how much of my own journey had informed my professional philosophy, the importance of creating environments where everyone could contribute at their highest level, the dangers of hierarchies that silenced crucial perspectives, the power of authentic leadership. 6 months ago, I had been a woman divided, living 2 separate lives with different names, different wardrobes, different levels of visible expertise. Now, I moved through the world as one integrated person, Olivia Reeves, financial strategist, risk assessment expert, leader, mentor, woman who had learned the hard way that diminishing yourself to make others comfortable serves no one well in the end. My doorbell rang, surprising me at such a late hour. Through the security monitor, I saw the concierge with a delivery, a stunning arrangement of white orchids, the same flowers that had decorated the tables at the holiday party where Andrew had dismissively called me his trophy wife. The card read simply, "Thought you might want these for your office before the summit. You always said they helped you think clearly. Wishing you every success. Victoria." I smiled at my friend's thoughtfulness, placing the arrangement on my coffee table where the elegant blooms seemed to glow in the soft lighting. 6 months ago, orchids had witnessed my public diminishment. Now they would accompany my most visible professional achievement to date. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. How objects, like people, can be reimagined and repurposed when placed in new contexts. The flowers that had once decorated a table where I sat silently, my intelligence dismissed, would now grace the stage where I would speak as an authority, my expertise sought after and valued. Returning to my presentation, I added a new slide near the beginning, a quotation that had become something of a personal mantra in recent months. The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me. No one was stopping me anymore. Not Andrew with his dismissive comments, not myself with my careful compartmentalization. The division was over, the integration complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I would face them as my whole self, no longer fragmented by others' expectations or my own compromises. The summit morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows. I dressed with deliberate care, a tailored charcoal suit similar to the one I'd worn on the day of the revelation, a subtle nod to the journey that had brought me here. Victoria met me in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt, where financial leaders from around the world were gathering for the 3-day conference. "Ready to inspire a room full of industry heavyweights?" she asked, handing me a coffee exactly as I liked it, black with a single sugar. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, taking a fortifying sip. Though it still feels surreal to be speaking rather than sitting anonymously in the audience. "Get used to it," Victoria advised as we made our way through the crowded lobby. "After today, anonymous is no longer an option for you." She was right, I realized. The story of my transformation from Andrew's trophy wife to Pinnacle's chief, risk and strategy officer had already attracted significant attention within the industry. Today's presentation would only amplify that visibility, firmly establishing me as a voice of authority rather than a curiosity or cautionary tale. The ballroom was already filling when we arrived backstage. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see hundreds of attendees finding their seats, many of them leaders I had studied and admired from afar during my years of hidden expertise. Olivia Reeves? A conference coordinator approached with a tablet. "We're running slightly ahead of schedule. Are you ready to begin in about 10 minutes? I nodded, reviewing my speaking notes one last time. The presentation was solid, i.e., perfect blend of technical expertise, strategic insight, and yes, personal experience. I had decided early in the preparation process not to shy away from my unique journey. It was, after all, a powerful illustration of how overlooked talent can transform organizations when finally recognized and empowered. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator's voice carried through the ballroom as the lights dimmed slightly. "Our next speaker brings a unique perspective on leadership and potential within financial institutions. As Chief Risk and Strategy Officer at Pinnacle Investments, she has pioneered an innovative framework for risk assessment that has been credited with significant performance improvements across divisions. Please welcome Olivia Reeves." Applause filled the room as I walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the sea of faces, attentive, curious, expectant. 6 months ago, I had sat in rooms like this beside Andrew, silently noting the flaws in presenters' financial analyses while playing the role of the supportive, decorative wife. Today, I claimed the spotlight on my own terms. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady. "Before I dive into the technical aspects of risk assessment, I want to start with a simple truth. The greatest risk any organization faces is failing to recognize the full potential of its people." For the next 40 minutes, I guided the audience through the innovative risk framework I'd developed at Pinnacle, weaving in case studies, data points, and strategic insights. The room remained engaged throughout, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of principles they could apply in their own institutions. As I neared the conclusion, I paused, taking a moment to connect more personally with the audience. Some of you may know parts of my story, I acknowledged. 6 months ago, I was introduced at a corporate event as just a trophy wife by my then-husband, who happened to be the finance director at the firm where I now serve as Chief Risk and Strategy Officer. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some had clearly heard the story. Others were hearing it for the first time. What he didn't know, what I had carefully concealed for years, was that behind the scenes, I held an MBA from Wharton and a CFA certification. I had been building my expertise in financial strategy while maintaining a completely separate professional identity. I could see people leaning forward in their seats, drawn in by the personal revelation behind the professional presentation. I share this not for sympathy or sensation, but because it illustrates the central theme of my presentation today. Hidden potential exists throughout your organizations, often in places and people you least expect. The question is whether your culture allows that potential to emerge and thrive, or whether it remains concealed beneath layers of assumption and expectation. The conclusion of my presentation was met with sustained applause. As I stepped away from the podium, the moderator returned to announce the Q&A session. The questions came rapidly. Some focused on technical aspects of the risk framework, others probing the broader implications for organizational culture. "Ms. Reeves," one woman asked, rising from the middle of the audience, "what advice would you give to women who find themselves diminishing their expertise to accommodate others' expectations?" I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would carry weight beyond the conference walls. I would say that while the path of least resistance can seem safer in the moment, it exacts a heavy toll over time. Your light doesn't threaten unless others are dwelling in darkness they're unwilling to acknowledge. Shine anyway. The question session continued for 20 minutes before the moderator regretfully announced we had time for only one more. A man rose from near the back of the room, and as he stepped into the aisle, I felt a jolt of recognition. Andrew. "Ms. Reeves," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "your presentation makes a compelling case for identifying hidden potential within organizations. In your experience, what prevents leaders from recognizing that potential, even when it might be right in front of them?" The question was expertly framed, professional, relevant, betraying nothing of our personal history to the hundreds of strangers listening. Yet between us hung 7 years of shared history, of seeing without truly seeing. "In my experience," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "we often see what we expect to see rather than what's actually before us. Leaders particularly can become invested in certain narratives about their teams, about individual capabilities, about what leadership itself should look like. Breaking free of those narratives requires deliberate effort and a willingness to be surprised by the talent that's been there all along." Andrew nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before returning to his seat. The moderator wrapped up the session with thanks and announcements about the next presentation. And just like that, my moment in the spotlight concluded. Backstage, Victoria was waiting with a bottle of water and an expression of barely contained excitement. "You were brilliant! And was that—" "Andrew," I confirmed, taking a long drink. I had no idea he would be here. His new position at Meridian would certainly justify attendance, she reasoned. His question was interesting. Professional, I noted. Appropriate. And loaded with subtext, Victoria added with raised eyebrows. Are you going to speak with him? I hadn't planned to, had in fact deliberately avoided industry. events where we might cross paths during these 6 months of rebuilding my life. But something about the moment felt unfinished, a conversation hovering just beyond the professional veneer we'd both maintained in that ballroom. I think I should, I decided. Briefly. Victoria squeezed my arm supportively. I'll be at the reception when you're done. No rush. I found Andrew in the conference center atrium, standing alone near a massive indoor fountain, his attention seemingly focused on the falling water. He turned as I approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Excellent presentation," he said by way of greeting. "The risk framework is impressive." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Meridian sponsored a panel yesterday," he explained. "Plus, I saw you were speaking and I wanted to hear what you had to say." The admission hung between us, neither professional nor personal, but somewhere in the undefined territory our relationship now occupied. "Your question was thoughtful," I acknowledged. A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "Seemed fitting, given our history." We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the fountain filling the space between us. So much had changed. In 6 months, my career had soared while his had reset. My public profile had expanded while he had maintained a deliberate low profile. Yet something fundamental had shifted in him too, visible in the way he carried himself, in the genuine, rather than performative quality of his attention. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Andrew said finally, "about all the ways I failed to see you, about why I needed you to be less so I could feel like more." I nodded, unsurprised by his self-reflection. The Andrew I had married would never have acknowledged such a thing, but this wasn't that man anymore. Just as I was no longer the woman who had hidden her light to keep his burning brighter. "We can't change the past," I said gently, "but we can learn from it." "I have been," he assured me. "Therapy twice a week for 6 months delivers some uncomfortable truths." He paused. "I'm actually leading a mentoring program at Meridian. Now, helping junior associates develop their potential, especially women who might otherwise be overlooked." The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that his greatest failure in our marriage had become the catalyst for his most meaningful professional contribution post-divorce. "That's significant," I acknowledged. "I'm glad something positive came from our experience." "More than you know," he said quietly. "Watching you today, owning your expertise, commanding that room, it confirmed what I've been thinking for months now. You were always this remarkable. I just couldn't allow myself to see it." There was no bitterness in his words, no resentment, just a simple acknowledgement of truth that had taken 7 years and a painful divorce to recognize. "For what it's worth," he continued, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not that you need my approval or recognition, clearly you never did, but I wanted you to know that." A conference coordinator approached, apologetically interrupting. "Ms. Reeves, the panel moderator was hoping you could join the leadership discussion in Ballroom C. Your insights on risk assessment would be valuable." I nodded my thanks before turning back to Andrew. "I should go." "Of course," he said. "You're in demand now, as you should be." We stood for a moment longer, these two people who had once shared everything and nothing simultaneously, a marriage, a home, an industry, yet living in completely separate realities. "Goodbye, Andrew," I said finally, extending my hand in a gesture that acknowledged our shared past while establishing our separate futures. He took it briefly, his grip firm but not possessive. Goodbye, Olivia. Continue shining at full brightness. It suits you. As I walked away toward Ballroom C, where colleagues awaited my expertise, I felt the final thread of my divided life snap cleanly. Andrew and I had begun as two people living one fiction, me as the trophy wife, him as the superior financial mind. We had ended as two people acknowledging one truth, that authenticity, however difficult, serves everyone better than comfortable deception. The journey from that holiday party where he had dismissed me as his trophy wife to this moment, recognized, respected whole, had not been easy. It had required dismantling the careful compartmentalization I'd maintained for years, weathering the personal and professional storms that followed, and rebuilding my life on a foundation of integration rather than division. But standing now, at the entrance to the ballroom where industry leaders awaited my insights, I knew with absolute certainty that the difficult path had been the right one. No more dimming my light, no more playing small, no more fragmentation. Just Olivia Reeves, financial strategist, risk assessment expert, leader, unapologetically brilliant, undeniably visible, finally and completely whole. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.